A Fear of the Woods, Chapter 1, Silence. They tortured us with silence. You do not need to hook up a man's testicles to a car battery or rip out his fingernails with pliers. The most effective tortures are ones that are focused on the victim's sensory perception. You can drive a man crazy by placing his head under a leaky faucet and then allowing a single drop of water to drip down and splash on his forehead. You can blast loud, obnoxious music and keep him up for days. You can even drive him mad by saying nothing at all. Silence is the worst torture of all. Have you ever laid in your bed at night in the completely dark house where there was no sound? The silence itself grows in your ears like a roar, like a low humming that just grows and grows until it envelops you completely. Human beings need human contact. We need some kind of interaction to keep us human. If we are constantly kept all alone and in complete silence, an anxiety will begin to grow. In our little cells, we built for ourselves a world of fantasy. Our minds became doorways to fantastic worlds where anything was possible. In my mind, I can taste ice cream or smell rain, or remember the feel of the wind on my skin. In the silence of my cell, I can listen to the beating of my own heart, or the sound of each breath. As I focused on these things, they began to slow, and I now realize that I can control them. Yes, there is something that I still have control over in this world where everything else has been taken from me. I can control my rate of breathing, the beating of my own heart. For countless minutes, I speed up and then slow down my breathing. At one moment, I am breathing like a man that has just run a marathon, while in the next, I hold my lungs tight and wait until they burn before I allow them to exhale and inhale again and again. I begin to sound like a woman who is doing Lamaze breathing. I breathe through clenched teeth, creating this whooshing noise followed by a deep exhale, where I do my best to expel every last molecule of air from my lungs. I force it out. I do this with my entire body, and I can feel the strain in my abdominals. Once every last bit of air is out, I gasp and suck it all back in with a deep inhale, expanding my lungs to their full capacity. I exhale and feel my head go dizzy. I see sparkles, and so passes another moment in my cell. I feel claustrophobic in the crampedness of my tiny cell. I am from a much bigger world, a world filled with trees and land. Today, my world has changed. I am sitting in my cell in a prison 2 hours drive east of my hometown. I got 18 months on my second GTA. I am only 19, and this has now become my longest stint in prison. I never graduated high school, but I don't blame my teachers or my mom. School had just become a meeting place of sorts where my friends and I got together to plan our day. It was from where we met up and let out into the great big world. We would spend our days sitting out on the banks of Battle Creek drinking whiskey from a bottle Jason had stolen from his dad. We skipped rocks and went down to the junk spot where all the old rusted out cars were left by the river's edge. Some were banged up pretty bad, others were not so nasty. The old junkyard backed up along the river, and we would jump over the fence and go through the old cars like we were going to find some type of treasure. I remember the sounds of the creaking doors as I opened them to look inside. I remember the musty smell of the interiors and how sometimes I would sit behind the wheels of those cars with my hands on the steering wheel and dream about going someplace big. The first time I shot meth was inside one of those old wrecks. I was with Danny Wilson, an older boy, and we sat in the cab of an old Chevy pickup as he showed me just how to do it. I was sitting behind the wheel as usual, steering off to some unknown destination while he was cooking it up. Danny was an older boy. I was 15 and he was 18. He was wearing dirty blue jeans with rips in the knees and a black Alice Cooper t-shirt and a jean jacket. He had black shaggy hair and his face was pockmarked. He had a ratty mustache and he was really focused on that spoon as he held his Zippo underneath with its flame raging. "What's it like?" I asked as I watched him cooking it as it began to bubble up in the spoon. "A rush, dude. It climbs up your arm like a chill, and then it hits your chest, And you can feel it push your heart like a jackhammer, Danny said. I turned towards him. Here, I said as I pushed up my sleeve and held up my virgin arm. In the cab of that old pickup, my arm glowed white in the afternoon sunlight. Back then, my skin was tight and milky colored. My veins wiggled beneath my skin like night crawlers. There were no bruises, scars, or scabs. It was fresh and willing and waiting. Danny drew up the brew and flicked the syringe twice. He didn't even need to tie off my arm. My veins were very visible. He just grabbed my bicep with his free hand and squeezed, which caused my veins to pop like hot dogs. He stuck in the tip of the syringe, drew back until he seen the flash, and then pushed down the plunger. I felt the cold rush like Danny had said as it crawled up my arm like a million tiny pricks from a cactus. It hit my chest and I felt the cold sweat come up over me and I shivered. Immediately I was racing. My heart was pounding like the hooves of 1,000 war horses. I feel great, I said as I opened the door of the old pickup and stepped out into the littered floor of the junkyard. I walked out a few steps, looking all around me at the world of rusted out heaps. As I looked around, it was as if my eyes were seeing 1,000 yards, and my ears were hearing every sound. The wind through the leaves, the beating wings of the birds, the screeching of the cicadas. I found an old piece of metal lying in the overgrowth of some switchgrass and took it up like a knight might his sword. I walked through the junkyard swinging my weapon up and over and around in huge reaching arcs. I then began to spin around like a tornado. Around and around I went, faster and faster till that final moment I released the piece of metal and watched as it took flight and flew up and away from me in a full reaching path out into the junkyard. The metal flew like a plane, like a powerful rocket trying its best to break free from the hold of the earth and push up through the invisible boundaries into the blackness of outer space. I watched it with sparkling eyes that were mesmerized in the dazzle and play of light in the day. I wanted it to break free. I dared it to try. I wished for something, even something that was just a broken piece of something larger, to escape and find something better than this world. It was that notion of feeling that something, a rusted, broken piece, might find freedom, and in that moment I too would see that myself, also a broken thing, might also discover the path to a new world. Go, I whispered to myself in elated joy as the hunk of metal reached the apex of its upward motion. Might Newton and Einstein have been wrong? Might just wanting freedom enough be the catalyst to breaking the hold of gravity and the world thus freeing the soul to fly upward into the limitless possibilities of what lay above? Could it be that all that holds our feet to the ground is just the belief that this is how it's supposed to be? If we believed hard enough and cast off the old ways of thinking, might then we just discover a new way that is lawless, unchained, and only bound by our imagination? Is the world just an illusion, and the only thing holding us here is our own misguided beliefs in this invisible prison? I watched the metal fly up, reach the apex of its climb, and then fall back down to the earth. It had not broken free of its chains. It was still held captive in this sick place. As it fell, so did my own heart as I watched it disappear down behind some old cars off in the distance and hit with a clang off out of sight. It had dared to test the limits of its own existence, but it had failed. The laws held firmly. The mathematics could not be challenged. There are some rules that are forever set in stone. There is the cold, hard fact of reality and all that comes with it. Some things are the way they are, and that is that. You are born into a life that you are not allowed to choose, and you move on from there. There is no escape. You can't shed your skin to escape bigotry or racism. You can't shed your sex in order to escape sexism. All the isms are the walls of your invisible prison. Poverty and ignorance are the guards. Hopelessness is the sentence. Without hope, every life is a life sentence. A death sentence that is always staring back at you in your mirror. Without hope, there is only despair and escapism. Just another ism that takes the form of drug addiction and crime. I took this path. I had lost hope. I sought solace in one of my many isms, but I dared to dream. I was like that tiny, ugly caterpillar that dreamed that he could fly. One night I curled up into my little cocoon, and when I awoke I had changed. I was beautiful, and in the new day's light I unfurled my wings to dry in the warmth. I tested my new wings, carefully at first, and then as they beat in unison and pushed free of the earth, I flew up into the advancing heavens. I was free for that moment, free if only in my own mind. The chief guard was Peter White, Sergeant White to us convicts. He was a burly Irish bastard with a big red nose and the busted capillaries from all the years of drinking. "I'll crush your fucking skull," was his favorite phrase. He had put us on lockdown and instituted this life of silence because of the drugs that had been found in the common room back on E Block. 2 weeks it had been, and until they finished their investigation, it might be till Jesus came back. We ate every meal in our cells. There was no rec time, no commissary, no visits, no phone calls. You couldn't even talk to your neighbor. If you were caught talking, then you would pay for the nicety with your own blood. A beating was common enough. It was just part of life behind these walls. Sometimes a man would talk just so he could get a beating. In that moment that he was being beat, he could scream, cuss, feel pain, feel anything. You were alive in a fight, even if you were losing that fight. You still knew in that moment of pain and blood you were still alive. It was 3 p.m. when we all heard the footsteps coming down the walkway and the repeated smack of the baton against the bars. Each man arose from his bunk to see what was the fuss. It was Sergeant White, and he stopped in front of one of the cells and smacked his baton hard against the bar 3 times. "I got you blackies now," Sergeant White bellowed at the 2 inmates inside the cramped cell. "It's all been discovered, and you 2 are being split up and shipped to different prisons in the state. You're out of here in the morning." His loud voice resonated through the silent block like a hellfire preacher on a Sunday morning. "Till you ship out, we're going to move Albert down to the end of the block to keep you separate. Open 1118, he called out. 3 guards took Albert from his cell and escorted him down past my cell to the end of the walk and placed him inside an empty cell. Sergeant White called out after the move had been completed, "I don't want to hear a sound out of this block or I'll come back in here and crush some fucking skulls." Albert was the most frightening black man I'd ever seen. He was 6'4" and weighed about 280. His arms were as big around as my thighs, and he had this nasty, jagged scar that ran down the left side of his face. He was bald-headed and as dark as coal. His cellmate was Terrence, a thin black man with green eyes and light skin. I'm not gay, but I would have to say that Terrence was beautiful. He had a beautiful soul and a kind heart. He also had a voice that could escape the prison walls and fly free up into the azure skies. Terrence sang in the choir of his Sunday service and would always do a solo that would bring tears to even the most hardened convict's eyes. His voice would rise up powerful like a mighty wind and then reach into your soul and touch you in a place that was secret and hidden. It would rise and fall like the waves on a sandy beach. He had sang in his church since he was a boy, and that is how he and Albert had met. The 2 had known one another all their lives. Terrence had always been the sissy boy with his green eyes, light skin, and good hair. He was obviously gay, but he sang like an angel in church, and his homosexuality had been overlooked. Albert had been his constant protector. Albert, in all his massiveness and scarred outward appearance, had been that one thing that always saved Terrence from the bullying of others. Albert was Terrence's shield, and Terrence was Albert's heart. They were 2 men that were incomplete until they had found one another. After Albert had got in trouble, and he had been sentenced to prison, Terrence had committed crime just so he could come inside and find his beloved friend. Inside they had found one another and became cellmates. And in the world of prison, their homosexuality was accepted. It took them coming to prison to find peace in the life that they had both chosen. Now they were forever to be separated. Both had been found guilty in the drug operation and were now being moved across the state to different prisons for the rest of their lives. And even during their last hours, they were split apart before they could have a last moment, a last glance, or touch before the inevitable. To what end would each man come to? It was like olden times when slaves were taken and placed on the block and sold. Families were split up, never to lay eyes on one another ever again, and to what fate? It was an endless nightmare of horrible images as the person's mind tried to create a scenario for their loved one. In the end, it was better to just imagine them in a better place, much like when a loved one dies. This is what it really was, the death of love. It was like the person had died, and you were now just left with all the pain and grief. Terrence must have went mad as he sat in his cell all alone with just the thoughts of never seeing Albert again. What could he do? He was locked in a tiny cell. He could scream, he could cry, he could fight and break his teeth on the bars. Instead, that gentle man did the only thing he could. He used the only power left to him, the last thing he had, his voice. As I sat on the edge of my bunk, I first heard the sound as it resonated through the insides of the block, bouncing off every wall. It started softly at first, but it grew with intensity until it filled every empty space there was to fill. The cell block was like a huge amphitheater that was specifically built for this one performance. It was as if the entire designs had been laid out in preparation for this man's anguished voice. It now did not matter that we were forbidden to speak. I doubt any man would have spoken as we all listened to the lifting up of Terrence's voice. The music was as beautiful, as stupendous as any classical performance you might ever hear. There was peace in his voice, passion, anger, love, all the things that give the soul the divine spark. It was his moment, that one moment where he found himself no longer afraid to shout forth his feelings. The words he sang were of little concern. I can't really remember any of them. It was not the words, but the music his voice made. And his voice did make music. His voice was an instrument, just as powerful and moving as any other. If Terrence had a piano or a guitar, he would have not needed them. All he needed, he had with him. His lungs and his voice were strong, stronger than the silence of this prison. He sang. He sang. From the far end of the block erupted the pounding of Sergeant White's steps as he hurried along the corridor down to Terrence's cell. The entire way he was screaming at the top of his lungs, but his threats could not be heard over the magnificence and power of Terrence's voice. Sergeant White stopped directly in front of Terrence's cell, yelling until he was red in his face and spitting like a rabid dog. He pounded his baton on the cell's bars, but even the deep bellow was drowned out by the uplifting tones that man sung. Then his song began to fade, and we then all could hear the threats being unleashed upon him. "You fucking nigger! Shut your fucking mouth before I come in there and crush your fucking skull," White threatened. There was silence. Like it says, there is silence in heaven in the book of Revelation as the Lamb opens the scrolls of judgment. It was the breath before the mighty plunge. Then there arose the sound of what sounded at first like the voice of a woman, a sweet, beautiful voice that was lifting higher and higher up into the rafters of the old prison. It was the moment in the opera when the lights drop and you are sitting in complete blackness, right before the strings start off softly and then begin to rise as all joins in once again. The crescendo began, and it was then that we all realized that heavenly sound was coming from Albert. He and Terrence had met in the church choir. Albert was a big, scary man, but as he stood with his body against the bars and both hands grasping tightly to those bars, he sang. His melody was so amazingly beautiful that even White was stupefied by the utter greatness of it. It was like a powerful sword that cut away all the threats and the racism and the prejudice and opened the world up anew. It was like that first morning in Eden, walking on the soft new grass in the golden rays of the first day. It was like standing on a sandy beach as out on the horizon grows a raging storm from which race forth the winds and comes the crashing of the waves. Nothing could stand up against Albert's song. There was not a threat that was great enough or a pain stinging enough that could halt this moment. You take a big man like Albert and all that he has held inside and you allow it to break open, and there is no stopping the tidal wave. The scar on his face had just been the first crack in the facade that he had been holding on to his entire life. On the outside he was a big, powerful man, but in here with Terrence he could be fragile, soft. He held fast his secrets, kept many at arm's length, but this was his last moment, much like the last words of a dying man. In later years, one thing would come to me to describe that wonderful moment in that hellish place when two men broke the deathly silence and sang. They did not sing because of anger, because they were in prison and were exploited by the system. They were below the heavens and at the mercy of men, and they sang despite all those things. In that moment, they could have been angry and shouted and fought, but they chose to fill that last moment together with love and the loveliness of their voices. Let me recite this to you. Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at the close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Though wise men at their end know that dark is right, because their words have forked no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Good men, the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men who caught and sang the sun in flight and learned too late they grieved it on its way. Do not go gentle into that good night. Grave men near death who see with blinded sight, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my Father, there on the sad heights, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. That is what has saved me, my rage against the dying of the light. Through all the darkness and the dark places that my life has went into and come out of, I always sought out the light. As long as you're alive, there's a chance. Each day brings a new chance to change everything.